The forest of no return. Halloween has always been a joy in the neighborhood. The children could not wait for the candy treasure, a game organized by the adults, who hid treats in safe places in the backyards. Lauger, excites crayons and competition to see who could collect the most candy, that was the essence of the party. Simple, but always exciting. But this year, something changed. Mr. Carter, newly vivid and enthusiastic, offered his house for the party. Located right on the edge of a small forest, this property seemed like the perfect setting for something more adventurous. He suggested that they spread some candy around the edges of the forest, just to add a touch of adrenaline to the night. At first, the adults were hesitant. There were rumors of strange things in that forest, but no one really believed them. After all, they were just stories, and it was Halloween. With the promise that the candy would be kept in the most visible areas, everyone agreed. As night fell, the entire neighborhood seemed to be lit up by the glow of the flashlights and the costumes of the children, who ran from door to door, searching the yards for hidden candy. The edges of the forest also received special attention. Candy was left near fallen tree trunks, among the low bushes, safe, visible places. The children collected the candy and returned to the yard, as planned. But Tommy, always the curious and adventurous one, was not content with the usual game. While the others were having fun, he looked into the dark forest and felt an irresistible urge to explore the pair. "I'll be back in a minute," he said to his friends, holding the flashlight. And before anyone could answer, he disappeared into the trees. As he entered the forest, the atmosphere changed. The flashlight seemed dim, and the darkness seemed denser, as if isolating him from the world. But Tommy kept going, thinking that maybe he would find some extra candy hidden, something special. It was Halloween, after all. A little fear was part of the fun, or so he thought. A few minutes passed, and his friends realized that he was not coming back. They began to call out to Vin, "Tommy, come back soon. We've already got all the candy." But the forest remained silent, an oppressive silence, as if it had swallowed their voices. Fear began to spread among the children, and they ran back to Mr. Carter's yard, where the adults were lounging and talking, oblivious to what was happening. "Tom is gone," one of the children shouted. The adults, thinking it was just a Halloween prank, laughed. But as time passed and Tommy did not appear, their laughter gave way to expressions of concern and fear. Organizing themselves into groups, the adults took flashlights and went into the forest, calling for the boy. But as they advanced, the fog seemed to thicken, and the forest, which had previously seemed small and arms, transformed into a mass of shadows and silence. After several minutes, one of the groups found something. Next to a log, half covered by the fog, was Tommy's flashlight. It flickered dimly, illuminating the damp ground full of fallen leaves. But there was no sign of the boy. They called out to Vin, shouted, searched the area around Vin. But the only answer was the sound of their own breathing and the soft whisper of the wind in the trees. The search continued for days. Police and residents joined together, desperate for any clue, any sign of Tommy. But it was as if he had disappeared without a trace. The only thing that remained from that Halloween was the fallen lantern and a dark silence. After that night, the tradition of eating candy in the forest was abandoned. The game continued, but now restricted to backyards, away from the trees. Stories about the forest began to circulate again, now stronger than ever. They say that, on Halloween night, you can still hear Tommy's voice echoing among the trees, calling for help, trapped in a place where no one else dares to enter. As for Mr. Carter, he moved away soon after the incident, leaving his house empty and abandoned as a green reminder of what happened that night. Today, no one plays near the woods anymore. Ichidastisati der, Toshid, Shunid, and Halloween was never the same again. The night in the abandoned house. Halloween always brought mystery and curiosity. But that year, my friends and I wanted something that would mark us forever. We gathered, as we always did, in search of an adventure scarier than the last. It was almost a ritual for us, challenging our fears in places that fed the city's legends. And nothing seemed more fitting than the abandoned house on the outskirts. It was an old mansion, known for its haunted stories and broken windows, where some locals claimed to have seen inexplicable lights, as if something still lingered there. We prepared well for the night. We took flashlights, phones, and even a camera, ready to debunk the rumors about the house. Deep down, we expected to leave laughing, convinced it was all just exaggeration. The road leading to the mansion was deserted, surrounded by twisted trees rising under the moonlight, casting unsettling shadows. When we arrived, the house looked even more sinister than we'd imagined. The imposing structure, worn down by time, seemed like a sleeping monster, waiting to be disturbed. The walls were covered in moss, the roof was caving in, and the garden was a jungle of dead plants and exposed roots. Jake, the bravest of the group, led the way, pushing open the old wooden door, which creaked loudly. As we entered, a smell of rot filled the air, and I saw my friends hesitate, though none of us wanted to turn back. Right at the entrance, we found an old lamp lying on the floor, covered in cobwebs and dust. Our flashlights illuminated details of the house, old paintings, deep cracks in the walls that looked like scars. Despite the growing fear in our hearts, we all pressed on. Jake, as always, led, climbing the stairs to the second floor, where legends spoke of unexplained phenomena. The second floor greeted us with a long, dark hallway, with doors lined up on both sides. The silence was absolute, except for the creaking wooden floor. When we opened one of the doors, we found an old bedroom with dusty furniture and a torn mattress, as if someone had left everything behind decades ago. Time seemed frozen inside, and the air was thick, laden with mystery and abandonment. That's when the noises began. First, a faint whisper from the back of the room. We looked at each other, trying to understand if we had really heard something. Then the whisper grew louder, and soon we heard something dragging across the floor, a muffled sound coming from under the bed. Our eyes widened, and in an instinct of survival, we ran out, slamming the door behind us, as if that could protect us from whatever was in there. But in the hallway, the panic only grew. Heavy footsteps echoed from downstairs, slow, as if someone was walking towards us. We knew the house was abandoned, but at that moment, it felt like we were far from alone. Jake suggested we go down and check it out, but I felt it was a terrible idea. Even so, urged by Jake's courage and the group's impulse, we pressed on. We descended the stairs cautiously, but as soon as we stepped on the last step, the footsteps ceased. Silence reigned again. We moved slowly through the main hall, flashlights trembling in our hands, when a dark figure crossed quickly from one side door to another before we could make out what it was. Immediately after, one of the doors slammed shut forcefully, the sound echoing throughout the house. We ran in terror, fear overpowering any rational thought. We reached the front door, trying to open it, but it was locked, as if something had decided to keep us there. The flashlights started to flicker, and a distorted laugh echoed from the corners of the house, surrounding us. Then, suddenly, the door opened as if pushed by an invisible force. We ran out, breathless, desperate, but the escape didn't end there. As we reached the rusty gate, we realized something horrifying. Jake, our bravest friend, was not with us. We called out for him, looked around, but there was no response. Heart pounding, we returned to the house's entrance, calling for him. But the house, which moments before seemed alive, was now wrapped in heavy silence. The door we had left open was locked again, and the windows, once lit by our flashlights, were now plunged into darkness. We tried forcing the door, but it was unyielding. Then we heard the laughter again, muffled and distorted, And that laugh, it was Jake's voice. We backed away in terror, with the echo of the laughter filling the air. It was no longer an adventure. It was a nightmare. Something in that house had taken him, and now he was a part of it. With heavy hearts, we slowly moved away, unable to look back. The laughter became just a distant sound, and soon the silence of the night dominated the surroundings. The next day, we called the police and reported Jake's disappearance. They investigated the house, but found nothing. No signs of struggle, no trace of our friend. All that was left was an old photograph found in one of the rooms, with a boy who resembled Jake standing next to unknown children. The police said it was impossible, since the photo seemed to have been taken over 50 years ago. Since that night, we never dared return to the house. The stories about the place became even darker, and everyone knew it was best to stay away. In the years that followed, some who ventured to the house claimed to hear a familiar laugh mixed with the wind. We knew then that the house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it had taken Jake, never to return him. Today, as we pass by the road that leads to the mansion, we hear whispers in the wind and avoid looking directly at that ruined structure. For deep down, we all feel that one day, the house will call us back. And I fear that if we answer that call, we'll end up just like Jake. The night drive on the haunted road. I've always enjoyed driving alone at night. The deserted road, the constant hum of the engine, the solitude filled only with my thoughts. It was a kind of peace hard to find anywhere else. But that Halloween night, something felt strangely different. I was coming back from a party, about 50 kilometers from the city, and it was already late. I chose a shortcut, an almost forgotten rural road lined with a dense forest. I'd heard of it before, but had never ventured down it. I liked the idea of avoiding busy routes and instead taking on an isolated path. The feeling of straying from the usual routes always felt liberating. As the minutes passed, the road grew narrower. The trees around leaned menacingly over the asphalt, blocking even the light of the moon. A dense fog formed, covering the road like a veil, and my headlights only illuminated a few meters ahead. Outside, everything was silent, except for the engine and the faint sound of branches snapping in the wind. Suddenly, without warning, the car began to slow down, even with my foot still on the accelerator. The engine sputtered and died, plunging me into complete silence. I looked around, seeing the road now cloaked in darkness. I checked the dashboard, but everything seemed normal. I stepped out to check the engine, hoping to find something obvious, a mechanical issue I could easily fix. But as I got out, I realized this wasn't a normal silence. It was an oppressive silence, dense, as if it absorbed every sound around. No animals, no wind, just emptiness. I opened the hood and examined the engine, though, to be honest, I didn't know much about cars. I pulled out my phone to call a tow truck when I saw a shadow. Out of the corner of my eye, between the trees, something was there. I quickly turned, shining my phone's light, but I saw nothing but the trees, still and mysterious. I closed the hood and got back into the car, automatically locking the doors, as if that could protect me from something I wasn't even sure was real. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but the feeling that something was wrong kept growing. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and my heart raced. In the mist, a figure was slowly emerging. Tall, thin, it moved with dragging steps. It had no face, just a dark and indistinct outline. My body froze with fear, and my heart pounded in my chest. Trembling, I tried to start the car, but it remained lifeless. The figure was getting closer, faster. Cold sweat trickled down my temples as I banged on the steering wheel, desperate. Then suddenly, the car started, and the headlights flickered. Without hesitation, I shifted into gear and sped away, leaving that place as fast as I could. The car roared down the road as the figure vanished into the mist behind me. I didn't look in the rearview mirror again. I just wanted to put that road far behind me. But the road seemed endless. The trees kept leaning over the asphalt, and the fog didn't dissipate, making it hard to see. Then, a few meters ahead, I saw it again. The same figure, standing motionless in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car skidded on the damp asphalt, and in an instant, everything went dark. When I regained consciousness, silence reigned once more. The fog had cleared. I was on the same deserted road, but the figure was gone. I looked around, trying to understand what had happened, but nothing made sense. I started the car again, and this time it worked without issue. Without questioning it, I sped up as much as I could, leaving that place as fast as possible. When I finally saw the city lights, a sense of relief washed over me. I made it home, but sleep was impossible. All I could see in my mind was that figure in the mist. The next morning, I told some friends the story, but they laughed. "It was just the fog playing tricks on you," they said. But I know what I saw. The shadow, the silence, the road. And to this day, when I drive alone at night, I can't help but check the rearview mirror, expecting to see that figure again. Because somehow, I know that somewhere on that lonely road it's still there. The pumpkin patch. Autumn always held a special meaning for my family. Every year, as Halloween approached, we'd visit the city's famous pumpkin farm. It was the most anticipated event. The kids loved running through the fields, picking out the perfect pumpkins, while my wife captured every moment on camera. But that year, everything felt different. Our usual farm was closed, without any explanation. Instead, a new farm had appeared nearby, almost as if it had emerged overnight. The name was painted in faded, stained letters at the entrance, the Harvest Garden. None of us had heard of this farm before, but curiosity won over the oddness. On the weekend, we loaded up the car and went to check it out. Upon arrival, an unsettling atmosphere enveloped us. The pumpkin field was massive, far larger than any other we'd visited. The pumpkins were flawless, with a vibrant orange hue and an impressive size, arranged in endless rows. But what disturbed us most was the silence. There were no birds, no rustling of leaves, only a heavy, suffocating silence. Ignoring the discomfort, we grabbed our baskets and began exploring the field. The kids laughed and ran ahead, soon disappearing among the dense rows of pumpkins. The farm was so vast that, within minutes, we lost sight of them. As my wife continued snapping photos, an unease grew within me. Something didn't feel right. As we went further, the pumpkins began to change. Some were deformed, with deep scars, almost like cuts across their skins. Others had faintly carved faces, expressions of fear, pain, even suffering. I called out to the kids, but there was no response. I looked at my wife, who was starting to look worried. We ran through the rows, shouting our kids' names. With every step, our desperation grew. Then I noticed movement among the pumpkins, a shadow, large and slow, moving at the edges of our vision, as if watching us. "Did you see that?" I asked my wife, who was pale, her hands trembling as she held the phone. On the screen, the last photo showed a tall, distorted figure dressed in black, with a head resembling a twisted pumpkin, glowing from within. My heart pounded. I yelled the kids' names again, trying to control my panic, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. Occasionally, I thought I could hear our children's voices, distant, as if they were playing. But every time I tried to follow the sound, it seemed to drift further away, carried by the wind. We reached a clearing in the middle of the pumpkin field. In the center stood a colossal pumpkin, far larger than any we'd seen. It glowed unusually, standing out among the others. As I approached, I saw it was carved like a Halloween lantern, but with an expression of agony, a contorted face with hollow eyes that seemed alive. That's when I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, and through the mist forming around us, I saw the tall, skeletal figure, with a twisted pumpkin head glowing from within. Its long, misshapen arms, its thin body made of shadows. Then it began to move, dragging itself slowly toward us. Gripped by panic, I grabbed my wife, and we began to run through the field, trying to find the exit. But the field seemed to have changed. The rows of pumpkins had turned into an endless maze, surrounding us. I looked back and saw the figure following us, always at a steady distance, but never stopping. Its movements were slow, but relentless. After what felt like an eternity, we spotted the exit. We ran as fast as we could to the car. We got in, locked the doors, and to our shock and relief, the kids were there, sitting in the back seat. They were strangely silent, their gazes distant, as if they had experienced a silent nightmare. We drove off without looking back. The road back home seemed never-ending, and everyone was lost in their own terror, in absolute silence. The next day, we decided to return to the place to try to understand what we had seen. But, to our astonishment, the pumpkin field had simply vanished. In its place was just an empty lot, covered in wild grass, with no sign of cultivation. There were no pumpkins, no evidence that anything had ever existed there. It was as if that place had never been there at all. Since then, every Halloween night, as I set out the pumpkins we carve, I feel a chill. Sometimes it seems as if one of them is watching me. I get a shiver as I notice the carved face's outline, and a voice whispers in my mind, saying that somewhere, that field still exists, waiting for another family as curious as ours to enter and never leave again. The Forbidden Mask. In my neighborhood, there's always been a legend told to scare children on Halloween. The legend of the Forbidden Mask. They said this ancient mask had been used in dark rituals by a cult seeking power through occult forces. In one of those rituals, they summoned something they couldn't control, an evil spirit, a demon from forgotten eras. At the last moment, before it could break free, they managed to imprison it within the mask. The legend warned, anyone daring to wear it would unleash the trapped spirit, which would take control of the wearer. My friends and I always laughed at these stories, thinking they were just tales to frighten people on Halloween. But that changed one night. We were looking for costumes for a party when we stumbled upon an old store on a deserted street, filled with strange, dusty items. At the back of the shop, almost hidden on a shelf, Lucas found the mask. It was terrifying, made of aged leather, with a sinister grin carved into it, a twisted smile that seemed to writhe under the light. There was something mesmerizing and, at the same time, profoundly wrong about that mask. "This will scare everyone," Lucas said, excited. The mask looked eerily familiar, and I remembered the legend. "You know what they say about that mask, right?" I asked. But Lucas just laughed, thinking I was joking, and put it on. The moment he did, something horrific happened. The air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped drastically. Lucas looked into the mirror, frozen, unmoving. "Lucas," I called, trying to break the oppressive silence. He turned to us slowly. Something was wrong in his expression. His eyes looked different, almost vacant. "I'm fine," he replied, but his voice wasn't the same. It was deep, menacing, as if another presence was speaking through him. Thinking he was just playing around, we laughed and told him to take the mask off. But he couldn't. Lucas pulled at the mask desperately, but it seemed to have fused to his face, becoming part of his skin. The more he pulled, the more the mask seemed to cling, as if it was feeding on his despair. "I can't take it off," he said, his voice trembling. We tried to help, but the mask was stuck, almost as if it had roots inside him, binding him. We went on to the party, but Lucas wasn't the same anymore. He was strange, distant. His movements were stiff, mechanical, as if he was fighting against something within himself. Sometimes he would stop suddenly, staring into nothing, as if hearing voices only he could hear. His laughter was disturbing, and his eyes, once full of life, were now dull. The party ended, and Lucas vanished into the crowd. We went looking for him, growing more worried. Hours later, we found him in a field near the forest, standing still, the mask still on his face. He was muttering words in an unknown language, his body trembling slightly. We tried to remove the mask, but it was useless. The mask had become a portal. The spirit had taken control. The Lucas we knew was gone. That night, Lucas disappeared forever. In the days that followed, there were searches, questions, but no one could find him. The police classified it as an unexplained disappearance, but we knew the truth. Lucas hadn't simply disappeared. He had been consumed by the mask. The store where we found the mask mysteriously closed a few days later. No one could locate the owner, and the mask, along with any evidence of its existence, seemed to have vanished. But the legends grew. Some locals began to swear that on the night of the party, they'd heard whispers coming from the forest, and some even claimed to have seen a shadowy figure among the trees, with a strange, twisted face, glowing in a ghostly way. Since then, we avoid talking about that night. The legend of the forbidden mask became more real than we could have ever imagined. On Halloween nights, I feel a dark presence when I pass near the forest, as if something is there waiting, just waiting. The Scarecrow. I was never one to believe in ghost stories. On the farm where I grew up, surrounded by cornfields and open sky, everything was always peaceful. The sun would set behind the rows of corn, and the nights were long and quiet, filled only with the sounds of crickets, frogs croaking, and the rustling of the wind. Nothing seemed out of place there, except for the Scarecrow standing in the middle of the field, with its worn straw hat and tattered clothes, gently swaying. To me, it was just part of the farm's scenery. But that autumn everything changed. The Scarecrow wasn't new. According to my father, it had been put there long before we bought the farm by the previous owner, Mr. Matheson. That man had a reputation for being a dark character, obsessed with ancient rituals and strange practices. People avoided talking about him, but I'd always heard that the Scarecrow was part of one of his rituals. To me, it all sounded like a story meant to scare kids. After all, the Scarecrow was just a stuffed figure with a burlap head, crudely sewn eyes and mouth, forming a grotesque grin. Nothing more than that. It all began subtly. I was in the field gathering some tools at the end of a workday when I noticed something odd about the Scarecrow. It looked different. I couldn't explain it, but its posture seemed altered, as if it had shifted position. I continued working, trying to ignore the feeling. In the following days, the sense that something was wrong only grew. I noticed that the Scarecrow would shift positions in subtle, but noticeable ways. Sometimes, it leaned to the right. Other times, it faced the field in a way that didn't seem natural. And at night, when the wind blew, I heard strange sounds coming from the field, wooden creaks, like something dragging across the ground. The discomfort grew stronger each night. Then, one evening, while my father and I were relaxing on the porch, we heard footsteps. Slow footsteps, as if something was walking across the field toward us. "It must be an animal," my father said calmly. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the field. When I got close to the Scarecrow, I froze. It was no longer facing the field. Now it was facing our house. That had never happened before. We always kept the Scarecrow in a fixed position, arms outstretched, facing the field as if guarding the crops. But that night it was turned directly toward me, its burlap head tilted slightly, as if it was actually watching me. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, perhaps some adjustment caused by the wind. After that, things only got stranger. Now, every time I looked at the Scarecrow, it seemed more worn down. Its clothes were torn as if someone or something had tugged at them. The burlap head was fraying, and the sewn-on eyes appeared deeper. The most disturbing part, though, was that it continued to face the house. Nights became a torment. Every time I looked out the window, I felt as if the Scarecrow was closer to the house. Over time, that sense of closeness became undeniable. Something strange was happening, something I couldn't explain. The wind, once a familiar sound, now seemed to whisper, bringing with it a suffocating presence. Then, on one particularly cold, dark night, the true horror revealed itself. I was in my room when I heard the sound of something being dragged. It was the sound of creaking wood, the same noise I'd heard so many times, but now much closer. I got up, filled with dread, and went to the window. As I looked outside, I felt my heart stop. The scarecrow was no longer in the middle of the field. Now it was at the edge of the cornfield just a few meters from the house. It wasn't supposed to be there. It couldn't be. Even from a distance, I could tell its head was turned directly toward me. Those empty, grotesque eyes seemed to follow my every move. Terrified, I ran to my father's room, woke him up, and told him what was happening. He tried to calm me down. Together we went to the window, and there was the scarecrow, back in the middle of the field, as if it had never moved. My father looked at me, speechless, but we both knew something was happening. The next morning, we decided to get rid of the scarecrow. Silently, my father grabbed a gas can, and together, we walked to the field. We burned the scarecrow, watching as the flames consumed its skeletal form, reducing it to a pile of ashes. There was no ceremony, no farewell, only the desire to end it. When the fire died down, I felt a temporary relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But the relief didn't last long. That same night, the sound returned. Something was dragging itself across the field, coming closer each time. On some nights, I started to see shadows moving between the rows of corn, figures that shouldn't have been there. It was as if something was still watching us. Sometimes, it felt like the scarecrow was still there, staring at me with that grotesque, empty grin. Now, every night brings with it the fear that whatever inhabited the scarecrow, that spirit or entity, is still out there moving through the field, drawing closer each day. And I know that, one day, it might reach the door, and I pray every day that it never happens. The call in the fog. I always thought fog was just something ordinary, even comforting. It would settle over our town from time to time, covering streets and fields, creating a mysterious yet harmless atmosphere. But that Halloween, the fog wasn't just a curtain of moisture. It was the beginning of something sinister, something that would pull us into an inexplicable fear. It all started when my girlfriend, Clara, and I decided to take a night walk in the forest on the edge of town. The forest was famous for its trails and the old legends that surrounded it. Stories of lost souls and entities hiding among the trees. We thought they were just exaggerations, tales meant to scare kids and tourists. Our plan was simple: a quick walk, enjoy the eerie Halloween mood, and head back home. That was it. When we reached the forest's entrance, something felt strange. The fog was thicker than usual, white as milk, covering the ground and making the moonlight and our flashlight nearly useless. Still, we continued, laughing and talking to break the silence. After all, it was just fog, or so we thought. As we walked, the cold began to seep in, penetrating every layer of clothing. The only sounds were our footsteps and our breathing, echoing along the empty trail. The air felt different, and the fog thickened with every step, hiding everything around us. Then Clara stopped and gripped my hand tightly. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, looking around. "Hear what?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. She was silent for a few seconds, then said, "I thought I heard someone calling my name." I laughed, thinking she was joking, but her face was serious, her eyes wide. Suddenly, I heard it too. A low sound, barely audible. A whisper coming from the fog. "Clara." We turned in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing, just fog among the trees. "I think we should go back," I suggested, a chill running down my spine. But Clara seemed transfixed. "No, I need to know who's calling me." She let go of my hand and started walking toward the fog with quick, determined steps. I shouted her name, but she didn't respond. The fog seemed to swallow her every movement until, within seconds, she vanished from my sight. "Clara," I yelled, but the only response was the echo of my own voice, distorted by the trees. Panicked, I started running in the direction she'd disappeared, but the fog grew denser, turning the trail into a maze of shadows and silences. Fear paralyzed me. Every time I called out for Clara, I heard her voice, but it seemed to drift further away, as if the forest was toying with me, drawing her farther and farther away. Then I heard it again, the whisper, but this time it was my name, a soft, almost seductive voice, calling from all directions at once. Come, come. The voice felt like it was inside my head, as if the fog itself was alive and trying to lure me in. Suddenly, the old stories about the forest felt terrifyingly real. Something was there, something that wanted to lead us off the path, to trap us. I kept running, desperate, until I tripped over an exposed root. I fell, and the flashlight slipped from my hand, going out upon impact. Darkness engulfed everything, and I froze, listening to the soft sound of footsteps around me. Clara, I called out hoping, but deep down I knew it wasn't her. An intense cold washed over me. Slowly, I got to my feet, and as I looked ahead, I saw a shadow moving among the trees. It was a vague form, disappearing and reappearing in the fog. I called out to Clara again, but my voice came out weak, as if the fog was absorbing the sound. The shadow seemed to come closer, floating between the trees. Then, the voice returned, but now it was right beside me, closer than ever. Come, you can't escape. The whisper was like poison, invading my mind, freezing my thoughts. I was trapped, surrounded by something invisible yet present. In a last act of desperation, I turned and started to run. Direction didn't matter anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. Every step was a battle against fear and the feeling that something was holding me back. The sound of my footsteps seemed to echo endlessly through the fog. Finally, I stumbled out of the forest, collapsing onto the trail, where the clear night air hit me like a punch. I took a deep breath, feeling freedom fill my lungs, but Clara wasn't with me. I returned to town in a daze and soon asked for help. The police began a search the next morning, and some townspeople joined in, but since then, she's never been found. The fog lingered in the forest for weeks after that Halloween, like a living presence, prowling the town's edge. And to this day, they say that anyone who approaches the forest on foggy nights can hear whispers in the distance. Whispers calling familiar names, trying to lure new victims into the darkness. Some of the older townsfolk say that the forest has its own hunger and that on foggy nights, it chooses those it will take. Now, every Halloween night, I avoid going near the edge of the forest. I know it's still there waiting, and I dread hearing the sound of my own name in the fog again. Because, like Clara, I'm afraid I'd never find my way back. The ritual. In every small town, there are always those scary stories that seem to come from nowhere, passed down by word of mouth like a forbidden legend. In my town, the legend everyone knew was about an ancient and dangerous ritual. They said it was a ceremony performed by a secret group, whose members no one could identify. The purpose of the ritual varied. Some said it was to summon spirits, others swore it was to gain some form of dark power. But one thing was clear: anyone who didn't understand these forces should never attempt to perform the ritual. Then one day, my friends and I found something that made the story feel all too real. In the attic of Lucas's grandfather's house, we found a book. It was old, with a thick, dusty cover and yellowed pages filled with strange, almost mesmerizing symbols. Lucas's grandfather was an enigmatic figure in town, someone everyone respected, but also avoided. He was quiet, and people said he carried an ancient wisdom passed down through his family, which had lived there for generations. Lucas's grandfather rarely spoke about the past, but on the few occasions he did, he would mention forces and the importance of respecting the supernatural. He seemed to believe in things we considered mere legends or superstitions. But no one imagined he kept something like that book in his house. Maybe, in some way, he was connected to the legend of the ritual, but Lucas had never talked to him about it. That night, driven by curiosity and a lack of common sense, we decided to try one of the rituals described in the book. Lucas was the boldest and wanted to prove those stories were nothing more than old tales. "Let's make this our Halloween adventure," he suggested. In the end, we all agreed. No one wanted to seem like a coward, especially that night. On Halloween night, we met in an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town. It was a gloomy place, and the atmosphere was enough to give us chills. We set up candles in a circle, as the book instructed, and the air grew even heavier. Lucas began reciting the words in a language none of us knew, and the air around us seemed to thicken. The candles flickered, and the cold in the barn became unbearable. Suddenly, all the candles went out at once, plunging us into total darkness. Someone yelled for Lucas to stop, but he seemed possessed by a strange force, his voice no longer his own, repeating the words in a dark, inhuman tone. Then a sound started moving around us, a slow drag, as if something was sliding through the shadows. None of us dared move. Somehow, we knew we were no longer alone. Something had been summoned, and Lucas, he was standing in the middle of the circle, but his eyes, they weren't his anymore. When the candles flickered back to life, Lucas was gone. It was as if he had vanished, leaving behind only the oppressive silence of the barn. The town was shaken by his disappearance. The police investigated, but as expected, no one believed our story. Lucas was declared missing, and we were left with the weight of what we had done that night. A few days later, Lucas was found. The police found him wandering along the road, barefoot, his clothes soaked in mud, and his eyes empty, as if his mind was somewhere else. They tried speaking to him, but Lucas mumbled incoherent words, almost pleas, mixed with fragments of an incomprehensible language, as if he were trapped somewhere we couldn't see. When Lucas's grandfather heard that his grandson had been found, he visited him, but his reaction was strange. It was as if he had somehow expected this to happen. When he heard of Lucas's condition, he just shook his head and commented on the dangers of the supernatural. He tried talking to Lucas, but received only nonsensical replies, fragments about shadows and things that were watching him. After weeks in a state of mental confusion, Lucas was admitted to a psychiatric clinic. He spent his days staring into the void, as if trapped in a never-ending nightmare. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would scream, saying that the shadows were coming back, that the ritual wasn't over. The doctors tried to calm him, but nothing seemed to work. The sedatives barely had an effect. As for the book, it mysteriously disappeared from the barn, as if it had never existed. No one knew where it went, and Lucas's grandfather never spoke about it again. He left town shortly after, carrying with him the same silence that always accompanied him. We never found out what he truly knew about the ritual, the shadows, or what secrets he kept. Today, sometimes, I feel a presence when a cold breeze passes at night, a reminder of that night that still chills me. And I can't help but wonder, will Lucas ever truly return to us? Or is he still trapped in that dark place that we unknowingly opened? The doll. It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon. My wife and I were strolling with Maria, our 8-year-old daughter, through the old streets of the city. It was the kind of place with cobblestone paths and buildings that looked like they were from another era. That's where we found an antique shop. Out of curiosity, we decided to go in. Maria, with her usual curiosity, went straight to a doll on a dusty shelf in the back of the shop. The doll wore a white lace dress, yellowed with age, with curly blonde hair and blue glass eyes that seemed to follow every movement. There was a crack on its porcelain cheek, like a scar. Something in the gleam of those eyes unsettled me. "I want this one, Daddy," Maria said, holding the doll. I tried to convince her to pick something else, but she was set on it. To avoid a scene, we ended up buying the doll. As soon as we brought it home, things started to get strange. At first, it was subtle changes in Maria's behavior. She spent hours talking to the doll as if it were a real person. My wife and I thought it was just childhood imagination until the conversations started sounding disturbing. She told me a secret, Maria would say with a distant smile that didn't seem like her own. We'd try to ask what the doll had told her, but Maria would always respond in an irritated tone. "It's just for me." Slowly, she began isolating herself, spending more time in her room. And when we'd call her for dinner, sometimes she wouldn't even answer, as if she were in another world, just with the doll. One night, we heard noises coming from her room. It was late, and Maria was supposed to be asleep. When I went in, I found her sitting on the bed, wide-eyed, pointing at the doll on the chair beside her. "She talked to me while I was sleeping," Maria said, trembling. "She said she wanted to take me back to where she came from." That alarmed me. I grabbed the doll and took it to the attic, locking it up there, hoping that, out of sight, Maria would forget these strange ideas. But that very night, we heard footsteps in the hallway. I thought it was Maria, but when I stepped out of my room, I found the doll sitting in the hallway, its eyes fixed on me. I rushed to check the attic door, and it was locked. But then, how did the doll get out? The next day, my wife suggested we get rid of it. I agreed without hesitation. We took the doll to a remote area outside the city and buried it in a wooden box, covering it with dirt and stones. Maria seemed concerned but didn't ask questions. That same night, Maria disappeared while we were out getting dinner. As soon as we returned home and called her name, the silence filled us with dread. We searched the entire house, the yard, and called the police and the neighbors. No one knew anything. When we entered Maria's room, to our horror, the doll was there, sitting in the chair next to the bed, its eyes fixed on the door, as if waiting for us. The police launched a search, but they never found our daughter. Maria had vanished without a trace, and with each passing day, the weight of what we'd done grew heavier. I couldn't get the image of the doll out of my mind. Every time I entered Maria's room, it was there motionless, yet with those glass eyes that seemed to gleam, as if holding a terrible secret. Over time, the burden became unbearable. My wife and I decided to move, unable to bear the weight of living in that house. We locked Maria's room and left everything behind, including the doll. We couldn't risk taking it with us. In our new home, we tried to start fresh, but one night, in the stillness, I heard something that froze me: Maria's laughter. I rushed down the hallway, heart pounding, and the sound led me to her room, the door slightly ajar. Trembling, I pushed the door open, and then I saw it. The doll. It was sitting on the bed, its glass eyes fixed, and in its lap a lock of brown hair unmistakable. It was Maria's hair. An indescribable terror gripped me. The doll had never truly left us, no matter how hard we tried to abandon it. And then, as if a forgotten memory had surfaced from the depths of my mind, a phrase from the antique shop owner echoed, almost like a whisper. "The doll chooses who finds it, and those who possess it can never be rid of it." At that moment, I understood that Maria hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken, engulfed by something we would never understand. The doll would never be just a toy, and no matter how far we tried to run, it would always come back. If you love mysteries and the supernatural, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Leave a like to support the work and share with friends who are into the supernatural. Your engagement keeps these secrets alive.